Welcome to the Retaining Wit podcast. I'm Jossie Haines.
And I'm Jordanna Kwok.
This show tackles the challenges of keeping women in tech.
Each episode, we discuss current events, experiences in the industry, and what it takes to create a workplace where women will thrive.
Welcome to another episode of the Retaining Wit podcast. Instead of interviewing a guest today, Jordanna and I are going to deep dive into performance reviews and how they are tied to retaining talent, especially women and underrepresented minorities. A crazy statistic I heard related to this is that only 14% of employees say that performance reviews are encouraging them. So we definitely have a ways to go in the tech industry. Hey, Jordanna, how are you doing after having just finished your performance review period?
Hey, Josie. Thanks for asking. It's been a really busy couple of weeks. Netflix just introduced a career ladder for engineers, and we had to assess each engineer on the team pretty much through a performance review. And on top of that, we also had our annual 360 feedback cycle.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm curious. How does the performance review process and that 360 feedback cycle work together?
They're actually intended to be decoupled. So the main difference is that with the performance review, it's really tied to the career ladder and it is intended for direct reports. And with the 360 feedback, that is general actionable feedback for anyone at the company. For example, you can give your boss 360 feedback. You can also give the CEO 360 feedback. And with the career ladder, it does allow for more directed growth-related feedback and to have a more explicit conversation with direct reports on how they may grow their careers versus the less concrete feedback that women in particular tend to get absent a framework.
Yeah, and I so agree. A framework is a great starting point. However, in tech, I've seen that we sometimes unfortunately focus on incentivizing the wrong things, even when we have a framework. Have you seen examples of this?
Yeah, I hear a lot about this from other peers in the tech industry around the gamification of performance reviews or promotions. Oftentimes, engineers will only accept the high visibility or high impact projects because those are the ones that get them the higher performance ratings that might lead to a promotion. Or it might be incentivizing them to chase certain metrics that the company cares about and perhaps at the expense of other things that would be very impactful in a different way. So I think there's a lot of fallout that could happen without more guidance from managers and senior leadership on what the purpose of the performance reviews should be, which is really around career growth for individuals.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've seen when it comes to career growth is because we're tying the performance reviews to compensation, this is where this gamification can come into play. And so I think if we can somehow decouple a little bit the performance review and giving that 360 feedback really tied to growth separately from the comp and the leveling, that also helps.
Yeah, it certainly helps if you do it at different points throughout the year so that they're not all happening at the same time.
Absolutely. And, one of my philosophies is performance review should be boring in a lot of ways. And what I mean by that is I tell my employees, if you're hearing feedback from me, especially constructive feedback for the first time, I've failed in some way in my role as a leader because I should be delivering this performance-related feedback on a regular basis through our one-on-ones. And this should really be kind of taking a step back and really thinking about it comprehensively.
Plus 100 on continuous feedback. It really shouldn't be something that's happening only once or twice a year. So I'd love to hear what managers should consider when they're writing performance reviews, since I often get non-actionable feedback like, you are intimidating and unapproachable. That's likely due to unconscious bias, and I think we really need to slow down our thinking when we sit down to write feedback.
Yeah, and going into unconscious biases, something that really impacts women is that unfortunately there is gender bias. And as women, we tend to get less concrete technical feedback. And a lot of the feedback we get is focused on our behaviors and our personalities instead. And tied to this as well, especially if companies are so focused on delivery instead of looking at all the different parts that go into building a product, women are not getting credit for what I call is the glue work. And what I mean by that is all those important little things like, hey, who's holding that other team accountable? Who's making sure that the definition of done is being upheld? Who's talking to the other teams and collaborating and coordinating? A lot of the time that work ends up falling to the women in the team, and then they're not creating as much code potentially, and they get negatively impacted for that. One of the things I like to talk about is leveraging impact-based job descriptions where you create your 30, 60, and 90-day goals, and you leverage those when you hire new employees. Again, so you have this clear goal setting. So hopefully when you're giving that feedback, you can directly slow down your thinking and tie it back to those goals. So you are hopefully giving the same level of concrete technical feedback to both men and women. And so I think this is just one of the things we have to be thinking about when it comes to performance reviews and feedback.
Yeah. And in terms of unconscious biases that creep in, there are quite a few of them that we should really talk about and to be aware of. Some that come to mind are affinity bias. It's kind of like, if I could be friends with this person, then I might inadvertently rate them higher in a performance review. And then there's recency bias, which is something that I often see. And having just come off a performance review cycle, there was a lot of feedback that I got from people on things that they saw 2 weeks ago versus from a year ago. And then there's primacy bias. It's really how first impressions kind of stick in your head. And it's the first thing that we learn about someone. And that could bias you towards not taking future performance into account. What are some other biases that you're aware of, Jossie?
Yeah. So another one is leniency bias. And so that's almost falling under being too nice and having a bias towards not giving that difficult feedback to folks and just generally just saying, hey, everything's cool and okay, even if it isn't. Another one that can come up is confirmation bias. And so this in some ways is affinity bias to an even deeper level, which is it's not just somebody who's like me potentially or looks like me. It's somebody whose values and beliefs are aligned to me. And so therefore I'm more likely to agree and want to be around that. And we also covered gender bias already, where women are having a lot of their feedback focused on personality and attitude versus men are getting much more concrete feedback about behaviors and accomplishment. But gender bias also has a big impact on non-binary and transgender folks as well. And so that's something we really need to be thinking about when we're looking at our performance reviews. But I want to pivot a little bit here and go back to the performance review cycle. And one of the things we haven't talked about is when you're scaling your companies and teams, we need to make sure that we're calibrating ratings. And so I'm curious, how does Netflix handle calibrations for performance reviews?
Yeah, this is very interesting because Netflix is a really large company and introducing a career ladder at such a late stage is unusual. Most companies that might go through this are smaller companies who are growing rapidly. They may start with a flat organization, but then introduce levels later. But at such a large company, yes, calibration is very important because you want to ensure that all managers are actually looking at the criteria and interpreting it in the same way so that there is a fairness in the process. And without the calibration process, it really can introduce, especially these biases where One person might be like, hey, we can be a little bit looser on, say, communication as a criteria, right? And this opens the door for interpretations that are all over the place. And at the end of the day, the people who are hurt most are the individual contributors. So the way that Netflix does it is really, it starts at the department level. So it may be with several managers for teams in a specialized domain. And within those calibration meetings, we discuss how to interpret and evaluate the criteria relevant to that domain. We also challenge each other on how we're evaluating each of our team members based on those criteria. Then the next round of calibration happens at the organizational or VP level, where we repeat the same process, but across many more domains. We also have post-calibration analysis, especially when it comes to figuring out whether there is unexplained differences in performance ratings between under and overrepresented groups, which could signal bias in the process. How does Tile do performance calibrations?
Yeah. And I think that post-calibration analysis is so crucial. What we're not measuring isn't going to move, right? And it's both positive and negative, right? So if we want to see positive trends, we want to be measuring and making sure we're seeing those, right? And so Tile actually, even though it's a smaller company, we did our calibrations in a pretty similar fashion. So all the managers submitted their performance reviews, and then we would do by team. So we do an engineering-wide calibration where all of the engineering managers and directors and senior directors and myself and the CTO would be in a room. We'd have the managers kind of go through theirs. Once we got to the manager level, we'd have them walk out of the room. We'd do the director level, so forth and so on. And then once we did each team, then we did across teams. So each of the heads of each of the different departments would get together and we'd do an org-wide calibration. And what we would do is we basically have a spreadsheet by level and look at all people at that same level across the organization. And then similar to what you had mentioned, we would also do an analysis and look at promotions by race, gender, ethnicity to see if we were having any negative impacts on this. And so yeah, that's how Tile handled these. And then also something that I had read recently that I thought was a great practice, but I don't think I've ever seen implemented, is running a survey after your performance review cycle and asking your team members, hey, do they feel it was effective and impactful? And did they feel the process was inclusive and reduced bias? And, I keep saying we have to measure things. So I love an idea like this for improving performance reviews.
I think that's an awesome idea. I've never seen this in practice. And yeah, I would be very curious if there are other companies who have done something like this and have gotten good responses and feedback that they've been able to use to improve the process over time.
Yeah. So, if you're listening to this and you have, feel free to reach out or put some comments. I'd love to hear about how you've implemented a survey like that at your company. And we've talked a lot about writing and giving feedback so far. But as we're wrapping up our show, a crucial topic is also how do we handle receiving feedback during your performance review? So for our retaining wit tip of the week, Jordanna, what are some tips you have for women when receiving feedback we may not agree with at work?
Yeah, it's very tricky, especially in a performance review situation, especially when you are talking to your boss about this. My tip would be really to approach it with curiosity. So ask questions to dig deeper and try to understand where the other person is coming from with their feedback. For instance, can they give you actual examples of what they mean? And that might help clarify how it may or may not be influenced by societal norms or expectations, or if it is in fact something that is legitimate. So, a lot of the next steps would depend a lot on how safe it is at your company to speak up. So start with curiosity and ask for clarification.
Awesome. And, I highly agree. How far you pursue it is really how safe you feel to speak up. I loved that was another great retaining wit tip of the week. And it was awesome getting a chance to chat with you about performance reviews. I'm so looking forward to our next episode.
See you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Retaining Wit podcast. You can keep up with our latest episodes at retainingwit.com, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast shows.